Hi, this is Corey McCray, the Senator for the 45th Legislative District, and you're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, my go-to source for the latest news and insight on state and local government in Maryland.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, it's Wednesday, March 25th. We are getting into the final weeks of session, and today we had the Mako Legislative Committee in town. That was a nice change of pace as we've been doing a lot of stuff hybrid, virtual, but everyone was in town today to kind of get a wrap up of where things stand. That was nice.
Yeah, I enjoy it. I kind of miss it. For years and years, we have been bringing county leaders to Annapolis on Wednesday mornings through the heart of the legislative session. And I don't know, our peers in other states find this mind-boggling. But in Maryland, our county leaders literally go bill by bill through the whole weekly slate of all the new bills that have been introduced. The staff works through all the things that have county government effects and things that would require us to change local programs or spend money or benefit something we're trying to do and so forth. So we sort through all those bills and we get our direction from our own legislative committee. Those are members of each county across the state. So those used to be in person every week. Like a lot of the world, we've shifted where that's a remote meeting most of the time, but a wrap up at the end of the session to go through some final touches, take up the last round of bills, and then give everybody a nice luncheon as a thank you. Seems like a good gesture, but I don't know, it felt nice having a lot of people in the room and sort of joking and so forth as we went through stuff today. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and a lot of that conversation focused on the budget and the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, and that's going to be our focus today. We're going to break down the state budget and the BRFA, or the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, and what both the Senate and the House did, and we're going to do that from a county perspective. So at a high level, the BRFA is where the real policy decisions sit. That's where lawmakers adjust funding formulas, shift costs, and plug into the structural gap. And that's where most of the pressure on counties shows up typically in budget season. And from the start, Mako has raised several concerns with provisions in the BRFA. The big ones included a proposal, assisted outpatient treatment for counties to establish that or don't, and the state will, and the counties will pay for it. So basically an unfunded mandate on assisted outpatient treatment, a recommendation to shift teacher pension costs, teachers, libraries, and community colleges onto county governments, a cut to the disparity grant program, and changes to the 911 trust fund. And there's a new provision, Michael, that we'll talk about that was added by the House and the Senate that has to do with law enforcement funding. So a lot of stuff going on in the proposed BRFA. The budget, again, is the budget, but most of the changes counties worry about show up in the BRFA.
Right. I think that's the case for a lot of stakeholders, but it's definitely the case for local government. Most of the things in the state budget, which is just a one-year spending plan, are really directed by state law that tells the governor, this is, fund this thing according to this formula and so forth. So a lot of the stuff is written in state law, and it's in the budget reconciliation bill. The BRFA is where the action is for county issues, generally speaking. And it's also they have a long afternoon hearing on the budget reconciliation bill. And that's where, you showed up and testified on all these different issues at the public hearings, but that's sort of the place where you have your say on the budget plan is usually in and around the BRFA bill. So that's mostly what we're talking about, but the committees kind of weave in and out of the budget and the BRFA. It's a little bit back and forth as they go through their decision making and stuff. So let's get into it.
Yeah, so we'll start with the Senate as they got the budget in the BRFA first. And I will say right off the bat, this was not a year where the BRFA hearing was a packed room, right? There weren't proposed changes to the lottery, so all the gas station owners have to show up and say their piece. It wasn't like that, right? We've seen in the last few years a lot more tax changes in the BRFA, and that gets a lot more folks involved and at the table to testify. It wasn't like that this year. There weren't as many people testifying, but the Senate did work through a lot of the issues we just talked about, the concerns that Mako raised, and they did scale back several of them. The first big one, they did reject a Department of Legislative Services recommendation to double that pension cost shift. So instead of the 39, they would double that to around 80 million. So the Senate said, we're not going to do that. They did keep, though, the original proposal, which was, again, to shift that $39.3 million onto counties. The Senate also rejected a $27 million cut to the disparity grant program and a multi-year freeze to the program. And they struck proposed changes to the 911 trust fund. So a lot of the issues that counties raised, the Senate heard those issues and they made the adjustments that we asked for.
Yeah, I think so. That's we're off to a pretty good start with the Senate being responsive to some of the pressure points that they heard from their local government partners. I mean, I think whether we like it or not, I think the 2-year decision on the budget plan that starts with the Senate accepting this idea of shifting some extra pension costs onto counties. I mean, I think in essence what they're kind of saying here is we're in the middle of the blueprint. We know that the blueprint is going to drive up sort of salaries for education professionals. We're going to have a minimum for teachers, and there's an overall escalation in the amount it costs to pay everybody who's in the business of delivering public education. So when you do that, that tends to elevate your pension obligations long term. And when that's on the books and your contributions go up for pensions, they're basically saying, we're going to just start billing the counties directly for half of these extra costs. And I mean, I don't love it. And I don't think any of our county leaders love this. The idea of, basically cutting a check for something you don't have any control over and so forth. But that seems to be where we are as a 2-year path. Yeah, you mentioned disparity grant funding. Like we've talked in some detail about that program, but I mean, the long and the short of it is the disparity grant was necessary because of the state cutting support for local governments. I mean, that's really the origins of the disparity grant go back to, gosh, we're cutting these counties so deeply, they're going to need resources to make up those programs so they don't just go broke. We'll give them extra income tax, but if that can't get it done, we'll help them. If they're a poorer jurisdiction, we'll let them get a little more juice out of their income tax. That's what the disparity grant is. So, when that gets cut or frozen, you end up with some of the lowest wealth jurisdictions in the state. They don't have anywhere to go, right? It's not,
Right.
it's not like these are wealthy jurisdictions who have been unwilling to tax themselves. These are the low wealth jurisdictions. So that's a tough spot too. And I don't know, we'll get into talking about the 911 fund, but I mean, I think we were right to raise a flag and say, man, digging into the 911 fund after we've made promises for years that it's just for these emergency service systems, like to say, oh, well, we have something that's vaguely really, let's dip into it. No.
Right. Yeah, that one is close to my heart. So is the disparity grant. We'll talk more
Yeah.
about both of those provisions. But these are, the disparity grant over time has been cut and capped. And so, like you said, this is for less affluent counties who have done the right thing, trying to raise revenue. They just don't have the tax base to do it. To cut a program like that, especially when you would affect a county like Allegheny, who, if you're a listener to this podcast, I assume you're up on the news. They're dealing with massive flooding out there. The federal government didn't show up. So this would have been another hit on Allegheny County, a poor jurisdiction who's already dealing with so much. And so really happy that the Senate deleted that provision that would have, again, cut disparity grant funded by $27 million and frozen the program for multiple years. What the Senate, Michael, did not pull back on was the assisted outpatient treatment provision. They kept that AOT provision, and that requires counties to reimburse the Department of Health for program costs, starting at 25% and then increasing over time to 100%. And that one, again, we did raise concerns with that, and I think we can get into a little bit of that too.
Yeah, I mean, as a fiscal matter, that's a long-term shift, right? And I think that's a big deal that the legislators are used to in the budget reconciliation bill, seeing a lot of things that say, in general, we want to continue on our path toward this funding level for this program. We had the Blue Ribbon Commission and they recommended we do this stuff and we're going to phase it in over 7 years or whatever. And we're in year 4 and now we're broke. So we'll take a year off and get back on track next year. Like that's a really common element in a budget reconciliation bill. But to basically say we're going to mandate and launch this program and require the counties to do it. But in the event that they don't, we're going to empower the state to launch a program in the county and start billing the county for the costs of it. Like that's a big policy debate that I feel like is more than just cut some money in the budget because it's a tough year. So I find that to be, I don't know, like when you spoke about it, I thought you did a good job illustrating this to the committee. Like this is something that feels kind of big for the BRFA, and the Senate didn't take it out, but I think we still should be in the game on this because there's a pretty strong policy argument, I think.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it. I think I talked about that in both the House and the Senate. That look, we have no qualms. Like we don't have any issue with the policy itself, and this is. Again, we're not talking about whether or not this is a good idea. We're talking about it's a big policy decision. It's probably deserving of its own public hearing, its own fiscal analysis, and just sticking it in the BRFA doesn't make a ton of sense. So that's where the House comes in, Michael, right? The Senate passed the budget in the BRFA. They sent it to the House. We talked about what they took out. The House, the first thing they did is to remove that AOT cost shift entirely. So they broke with the Senate there. They took our amendment to say that this is not a provision that belongs in the BRFA. This is something that should be standalone, and we're not just going to put this big policy shift and fiscal shift into the BRFA. So the House decided we're going to take that out and break with the Senate.
Right. And I think it's an important one. And we got a little bit of a signal on this. I think we had a meeting with a number of our county leaders, elected leaders, with the Speaker of the House and President of the Senate. And the Speaker's really familiar with this program. She's a real advocate, diehard for it. And I think she'd probably prefer to see this come together the right way, not, do it in the bill, not in the BRFA.
Right. And so I agree with the Speaker 100%. I think this is near and dear to her heart, and she wants to see it worked out. Not that we don't, again, but I think there's a better way to do it. So that is a significant, item that they took out of the BRFA. It avoids a new state mandate that would have expanded over time. After that, Michael, the House mostly lines up with the Senate. The House also rejected the DLS recommendation to double that pension shift. So again, they kept it at the proposal that the governor made. They also preserved disparity grant funding, and they leave the 911 trust fund unchanged. So I would say, pretty good efforts there to get a lot of those provisions that were problematic out of the BRFA. But when you're talking about, the governor puts in the pension shift, $39 million, it's hard to get something like that out, right? Because then you need to find another $40 million to replace. You have to cut something else. We know there's a lot of pressure on, from the disability community. They face a big cut this year. So I think that one was going to be difficult to get out. We certainly didn't want to see it doubled, which DLS recommended. But all in all, I'm happy with the Senate and the House and hearing from county governments and hearing the pressures that we face, just like the state does.
I think that's a good framing. Like you have to be realistic in this circumstance. And we come to the table and point out how we disagree with some of these decisions, including the pension shift that it looks like they've basically agreed they're going to leave in the plan. Now, in terms of the process, we're not quite done yet. The House is moving their version of the budget sort of now, and the issues where the two sides disagree, they'll resolve it in a conference process. So they'll have leadership senators and leadership delegates work out those differences and bring a final version to the floor for final passage. So, we'll still have our say. I'm trying to get that, agree with the House. Let's take this AOT issue off the table, hash that out in a real bill, and build that program the right way. Hopefully that'll prevail. Mm-hmm. But you can't pull everything out of the plan. Otherwise, the whole plan falls apart. Like the reason you have a reconciliation bill is because it's a tough year and you need to move money around and you need to make some sacrifices and so forth. And pulling a $40 million line item was probably not realistic. I guess we're lucky we dodged the bullet that there wasn't a massive change in the revenue forecasts to the bad, because that could have been our worst case where we see that number double and some of these other things might have had to stick in, the disparity grant and whatnot.
Now, Michael, when it comes to, obviously, we talked about the things that were taken out. The pension shift remains. That's the main issue that's left on the table in the budget in the BRFA for counties. That $39 million is ongoing. Counties have to absorb it across teachers, community colleges, and libraries. And Michael, we can go all the way back to 2012. and a deal that was cut then. But what is it? I mean, even just this remaining shift, which again, we're grateful to the House and the Senate for the changes that they made, but talk about what it means to absorb costs like this. It is, in my mind too, I'll say it's a little hypocritical to hear, lawmakers talk about what, Washington is doing and then seeing them turn around and kind of do the same thing. But I mean, we have limited ways to pick up costs like this, right?
I think that's absolutely true, and it kind of gets lost in this fight. I mean, I don't mean that as a slight on the state fiscal leaders, but they're focused on their column of numbers and what does it add up to and what's their bottom line look like, right? And correctly so. They have a constitutional responsibility to pass a budget plan that adds up for the year ahead. That's every year. You can't go home until you have a balanced budget passed. Okay, well, in the service of doing that, in a tough year like this year, it requires a bunch of tough decisions, and we're going to have to cut this and do with less there, and so on. And they shift costs like this onto counties, and then for their purposes, the money's just gone. It's over. And so now they can almost book it as like it's like a $40 million tax increase. It's just we're going to send an invoice to the 24 counties. They just have to pay it. And where are we going? Like we're gonna take this in property taxes. We've got most jurisdictions are already at or very near the absolute limit on their local income tax, and so and locals have other odds and ends things, but what are you going to do? Pile on the real estate market with something like a recordation and transfer tax?
Right.
Today, you're worried about housing, and you're going to burden the housing market with a new spec. I mean, there's only so many places to go to find $40 million on top of the what was it last year, 95 or somewhere in that ballpark, close to $100 million that we got to pay again this year. That didn't go away.
Right.
So you add this stuff up, and now it's like close to $150 million that just shows up as an invoice. Pay the state to do the program. There's just not. It's property taxes. That's who's going to eat it. This is going to end up mostly landing on property taxes and potentially like service cuts and things that we're delivering, on the ground level. So I don't know. You also mentioned Washington, right? I mean it kind of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, right? Back in the summertime on the big beautiful bill that included tons of components of shifting costs onto states, we had our congressional delegation and our state fiscal leaders all saying this is terrible policy by the federal government to shift this downhill and balance their budget by harming state governments and sending us the cost for programs like Medicaid and SNAP and so forth. And here we are, the same leaders doing the same thing to their local governments. So just get it off our books onto yours. We move on. Don't love it.
Right. And look, to be fair, I mean, counties face the same pressures the state faces. We're dealing with the same economy. We're dealing with increased costs. We're dealing with all the uncertainty in Washington. And like you said, I mean, we have property tax and we have income tax. Every county is maxed out or very near maxed out on the income tax. Nobody wants to raise property taxes. That's not good for affordability. So, again, we want to increase housing. We want to make it more affordable. But at the same time, we're basically telling local governments to increase property taxes to deal with the state's issues. So not ideal. But again, I think, it is what it is. And I want to spend a minute, Michael, on the 911 Trust Fund and broader emergency management issues generally. Both chambers, as we mentioned, rejected changes to the 911 Trust Fund to take money out of the 911 Trust Fund and to use it for emergency management. That's really important to reject a shift like that, because not only does that money support 911 centers, 911 specialists, and upgrades to next generation 911, and we've talked a lot about that on here and the efforts in Maryland. It's also illegal under federal law, and we would risk federal dollars. So that was problematic. But I will say it's really important that we figure out a solution for our emergency management system here in Maryland. We mentioned earlier the flooding in Western Maryland. That flooding met every benchmark for federal aid, and Maryland was denied federal aid and was denied upon appeal. So in this new world where we can't rely on the federal government, no state is able to pull the resources that the feds can pull. If we have a major event, a hurricane, a big tornado, flooding, all things that easily happen here in Maryland, and the feds aren't going to show up, there's no way to backfill all of that. But we have to get prepared in some way. So I understand what the state was trying to do and say is that, hey, we understand. We're hearing from emergency managers at the local level. We're hearing from the Maryland Department of Emergency Management that FEMA is not coming. So we need to find a way to at least get some dollars in reserves, ready to go, so that when we have these events, we got money to deal with it. But this is not the place to go. And so I understand. I am very sympathetic. I cover these issues for MACO. I work with our emergency managers, but that just wasn't it. Our emergency managers agreed with that. We can talk about some other bills that are moving, Michael, but that one was important for a lot of reasons. But again, we're very sympathetic to emergency management operations and what's going on in Washington.
But I think that's part of how a shop like MACO remains credible and valuable in the policy process. Is on an issue like this, we didn't come to the table and say, no, no, no. What we said was, you're right. We need to have a stable way to support our state ability to respond to an emergency because there's this uncertainty with the federal government. And, whatever the machinations are with our federal leadership in Congress and in this administration, it's just not as clear as it used to be for decades that we could count on the federal government when we have a disaster. And whether that's, a red and blue issue, or it's a rethinking of what the obligation of the federal government is to its regions and states and so forth. I mean, that's a separate podcast, and it would probably be an engaging one to listen to. So I'll use my favorite phrase. We can put a pin in that for the moment. But here we are today. You need a stable source of funding. We can say at the same time, don't take it out of the 911 trust fund. That's the wrong way to solve the problem, but do solve the problem. And as it turns out, we were lucky that there were a couple other ideas sort of percolating that I think give them viable options to come up with a real solution here. You want to get into that a little?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. We're seeing movement on a few bills this session that MACO and our emergency managers support to address that gap more directly. And again, we do need a dedicated solution, but there's a bill that would study this issue and study ways that the state can prepare and study different sources of income that could be, called upon in the event of a disaster. There's another bill that would kind of speed up the process for the governor to transfer money in to the state disaster recovery fund. And that's a fund that MACO advocated for a few years ago, kind of looking around the corner and seeing what was coming, that we needed to have a dedicated way to get money out the door quickly for disasters that don't necessarily meet the federal threshold. So more small scale disasters, but you still need to get resources out the door quickly. Using that fund, we used the fund in Western Maryland. It came to fruition, and the money got out the door quickly to help people there in the wake of that flooding. But I think there's also an understanding that, again, with these new problems coming out of Washington and FEMA not showing up, the ability for the state to act quickly and get money into that fund, that bill should move and finish, and the governor should sign the bill. So a couple bills that are trying to deal with this issue long term and to look at it and figure out what we can do. But I'll say it again, there is no state that has the resources the federal government has to respond to disasters in the way that the federal government used to do. So it's going to be a gargantuan effort. And it's not just Maryland who's dealing with this. Every state is trying to figure out what to do here. But unfortunately, when we're in a political environment like we are, when Maryland meets all the thresholds for disaster assistance, we get denied. Another state that maybe has a different political persuasion, they get money right away. It's really, really concerning that we're living. This is not the way we should be dealing with disasters and disaster funding. It shouldn't be political. And I think the General Assembly is doing the right thing and trying to look at ways we can mitigate, all the uncertainty in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, you've got no choice but to step up and try and fill those gaps. So do right by Allegheny County and Western Maryland, who just suffered their own disaster. I mean, you can't just let them flow downstream. Yeah. But at the same time, let's hope that there is more clarity and a better resolution through the federal process, given some time here. Hopefully this is a temporary measure we got to fix for it.
Very much hope so. And Michael, we mentioned another provision that's still in play here, and it has to do with law enforcement funding, with state funding for law enforcement. So the House and the Senate add a provision that requires the suspension of state aid for police protection for that program, that programmatic funding to law enforcement to be withheld if it is determined that a local law enforcement agency is not compliant with a new state law related to immigration enforcement agreements. So we're talking about a law that was passed this year by the General Assembly, essentially doing away with 287G agreements. And so they've added this language now that says if we can't verify that you have not complied with that law, with that any local law enforcement, so county police or sheriffs, that if you haven't complied, we're going to withhold well over $100 million in state funding for law enforcement. That's a new provision, Michael. Obviously, it has to do with legislation passed earlier this year. We know what it's about. But Michael, talk a little bit more about that and what it means from a county perspective and how this gets a little bit tricky.
So first of all, it's not a novel or brand new concept that the state would say, we're going to fund a program, but there are strings on the funding, and you have to demonstrate that you're doing A, B, and C to get the money, right? So it's not a question of we're saying, oh dear, strings on funding so that we comply with state law. We're just unwilling to do that.
Right.
That's not where we are, and things like that are pretty routine. Whether it's an administrative agreement or a maintenance of effort requirement that you keep putting in your share to get your extra money from the state. I mean, those things are pretty common in lots of different programs. But what's peculiar here is county by county, there are different structures for who manages primary law enforcement and who manages the correctional facility. And who cares? For the most part, who cares, right? You pay your county taxes, you pay your property tax bill, and you get your services from your county, from your town. Some of it comes from the state, they help out, blah, blah, blah. The reason this is tricky is because in about half our counties, it's the sheriff who does primary law enforcement. Sheriffs and deputies outside of a municipality that might have its own police force, they're the ones who are law enforcement. So they're the road patrol, and they would be the ones who would respond to your 911 call if you're feeling unsafe or that sort of thing.
So Michael, and that's important because I think a lot of people don't understand the distinction. Every county, counties have sheriffs, right? But in half the counties, like you said, they're primarily law enforcement and other functions. But in the other half, they're mostly dealing with courts. They're transferring people from jail to court, right? They're serving warrants.
Right.
They're not doing like the patrol on the street like a county police force would. But in some counties, like you said, the sheriff is the whole deal.
Right. So generally speaking, it's the larger counties, the bigger charter counties have county police departments. So rather than having the sheriff be primary law enforcement, they've taken it over. We live in Anne Arundel County. Anne Arundel County has a county police department. There also is a sheriff who has a limited series of responsibilities, but the sheriff in a big county like Anne Arundel doesn't run the jail and doesn't do law enforcement. But in most of the counties on the Eastern Shore and in Southern Maryland and Western Maryland, there's 15 counties or so where the sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer. And why this matters is the sheriff is independently elected. They get their funding for the sheriff's budget comes through the county government, so it still comes from county taxpayers. But the sheriff is not somebody that the county government manages or hires and fires in the way that Anne Arundel County does with its chief of police. So that's a totally different relationship, and that's what makes this really tricky. I mean, like, I know we sometimes get into nerdy structure of government issues here, but the structure of government thing really matters here. You've got a potential, you've got a potential for the state to put a practical requirement on a sheriff. Don't do this, don't sign this paper, don't do these things, and certify that you're not. But then the consequence nominally would fall on the county government. I think if all this aid for police protection is just going to be withheld for County X because their sheriff has decided I'm not filling out this paperwork,
right?
Then what are the taxpayers and residents in that county supposed to do,
Right.
right?
And by the way, the taxpayers don't understand the
Right.
difference, right? They
Yeah.
don't, like you said earlier, who cares? I just know that I'm getting my services. But if the state withholds this money, it creates a lot of uncertainty locally. What are you going to do? Just, let the money not show up and let them deal with massive budget issues with your law enforcement agency? I think that's a tough spot, right? But like you're saying, a county government with an elected sheriff who handles primary local law enforcement, they have no say over what the sheriff does, what kind of papers the sheriff signs or
Right.
doesn't sign. So it is a weird blip, Michael, in terms of structure of government stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it leaves us in a really weird spot. If this is, we've got that the Senate and House preliminarily have agreed that they want to do this. If they leave town and this is in the budget plan, this will probably be topic number one with county government officials to figure out, what do we do?
Right.
How does this play out in my county if our sheriff, we can't control our sheriff, so if the sheriff decides to do this because he believes he's an independent decision maker under the Maryland Constitution or
Mhm.
under the U.S. Constitution, or just philosophically disagrees with the Maryland General Assembly and the consequences are somebody else's to deal with. What do? You come up with $2 million of local taxpayer money to fill in that gap because the sheriff has a principled stand against what Maryland did. I don't know. I don't know how this plays out. I don't know how anybody can have a firm answer to that.
Right. So more to come there for sure. And Michael,
Yeah.
that reminds me of another provision related to law enforcement that showed up in last year's BRFA. We raised a lot of concern with the provision, and then that brings us into this year. We're talking about people who were wrongfully convicted and then get a settlement from the state. Who should pay for that, right? And there was a provision in last year's BRFA. Again, this did not get a public hearing or a fiscal analysis. It was just stuck in the BRFA that counties have to pay 50% of the cost for people who were wrongly convicted and receive a settlement from the state. Now, to be clear, counties have nothing to do with these decisions. Counties are not prosecuting these cases. State's attorneys are not county employees. So we're not prosecuting these decisions. We're not obviously presiding over the precision. The county judges are not county employees. We have nothing to do with the appeals, and we have nothing to do with the Board of Public Works, who makes these decisions on wrongfully convicted incarceration payments. But now we're being asked to pay 50% of the bill. So this year, MACO, working with Delegate Mike Griffith, put a bill in to reverse that cost shift. Michael, there was a hearing last week. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to conclude anything other than we're right on the policy, right? I mean, you can't stress this enough. It's another of these cases where there's an independent entity in the state's attorney who are they're directly elected by the voters of their county to conduct prosecutions of basically state crimes. So, I mean, this is an office created by state government, elected directly by the people, not managed or overseen or you could say hired and fired by the county government. The Wicomico County Executive and Council do not have any. There's no nominate the person for the job and then the council would have to confirm them or anything like that. These are not county employees. They're not people we manage. So as a practical matter, the idea of saying the county needs to eat it because they're the ones who messed up, it's nonsense. And honestly, in the big case that's pending right now, we have a small county who's facing a more than $1 million cost here, and everybody agrees that the mistake was made by a state employee at the
Yes.
state crime lab, and that person messed up and either falsified or made mistakes in the analysis of evidence in that crime or in that trial, and now the conviction's been overturned. The person was incorrectly incarcerated and deserves their payment.
Yes.
But the idea that county government needs to eat it is just, it's hogwash. And I mean, nobody would have built this law this way if it had been through the normal process. You have a whole, if someone just put in this bill by itself, this is a neat idea. Let's do this and bill the counties. You would have been laughed out of the hearing room. I'm not exaggerating. I think it would be like, that's a ridiculous idea. But in the BRFA, it just it seems like a good idea. Let's throw it in and squeeze a few more $1 million for the budget.
Yeah, Michael, it's it's remarkable to me. I kind of went through the reasons why counties have nothing to do with this, and particularly when it comes to state's attorneys, like you mentioned it. These are not people hired and fired by county governments. They are not county employees. But Michael, it's crazy to me that hearing goes on. You hear some of the questions from the committee, and one of the first things is, well, state's attorneys are county employees, right? So why would? And it's like, what? I just don't understand how people don't get it. Quite frankly, I know that this did not get a public hearing last year, so it's not like the Judiciary Committee has talked about this issue. This was in the BRFA and the Appropriations Committee, right? They haven't really dug into this. They get this hearing. There's questions about it. We had county attorneys there who did a great job, and they kind of walked through these issues. And you mentioned one of the cases, the egregious. There was a state employee who made a mistake at a state crime lab, and now we're being asked to pay a bill. It's kind of crazy, but it's concerning that, people just can't seem to connect the dots and separate, well, state's attorney for Anne Arundel County, that must mean that they are Anne Arundel County employee and that the county controls what they do, right? And it's mind-boggling to me that people just don't seem to get it.
Right. Like on each of these issues, the idea of holding back funds to the county government based on the actions of a sheriff who doesn't answer to county government and invoicing a county government for maybe a mistake made by the prosecutor who is directly elected, also not answerable to county government. This is fundamentally different than, I don't know, let's say the state said, we want to see every park department do this thing, put up these special signs, or create this access for disabled residents in your community, or something like that. And if they wanted to say, if you don't do these things, then we'll withhold some of the funds that help your parks department, we would say, we don't like being pushed around, but at the same time, we manage and hire and fire the parks directors. That's a county government responsibility. And if you want to make us do it and use the power of the purse to force us, we might not like it, but it's not absurd on its face like these are. Like holding us responsibility for the practices of an independently elected state's attorney, or in the other case, for a decision, a political decision or a practical decision being made by an independently elected sheriff and saying, yep, the county government needs to eat it, is just absurd on its face. Weird stuff happens in tricky budgets. I get that, but man, this is weird stuff.
Yeah, and so we could talk about this for hours, and and we have, and we will probably continue to do that. But stepping back into this year's budget plan, the budget and the BRFA, I think MACO's position. This is bread and butter stuff for MACO, right? Avoid shifting state responsibilities onto counties, protect that core funding that we rely upon to fund schools, public safety, public health, all those things locally. We're dealing with the same issues the state is dealing with. And again, to preserve that local decision making, no one is closer to residents than local governments. So you see that reflected in several of these outcomes in these budget conversations. The AOT cost shift comes out of the House, disparity grant funding remains intact, the 911 trust fund remains intact. We're still dealing with this partial pension shift. We're not done fighting to strip that provision out of the plan and conference committee, but that's kind of where we are. And again, thankful to the budget committees and the leadership for hearing from county governments, hearing these concerns, not wanting to put additional pressure on the counties that can least absorb those increased pressures. All that stuff is really important, especially in the times we're dealing with right now and all the pressures. And Michael, I will say, while this budget relatively quiet at this point for this year, and like I said, there weren't hundreds of people in the room trying to testify on the BRFA. I think my crystal ball next year is going to be a disaster, and I imagine the committee rings will be full when we have the budget and the BRFA hearings, because next year is going to be really, really tough. I just, we're going to get through this election, and then I think things are going to look different. So while things are relatively quiet at this point, and we can talk about all the things that we were able to get stripped out that would have been problematic for counties, next year is going to be a different story.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, all the signs point that way, right? We've at this point, the kind of people who would make it to the end of this episode of the podcast, like are interested in these numbers issues and the budget process and that sort of stuff. But like everybody of that flavor has seen the table that the state is facing, where the structural deficit, or whatever number you want to take a look at, but year by year, it's like pretty bad this year, and then it just yawns to a huge number next year.
Yeah.
3 billion or more already. And I think the smart money is that when it's all said and done, the number will be even bigger. So the details will fall into place in time for next year's considerations. But if this year turned out to be not a massive crisis and the governor's plan is at least pretty close to the final overall plan, like we're not hearing massive rock the boat changes from the Senate and then the House over these last couple of weeks. It's been nip and tuck kind of stuff. So this is that kind of year, but next year is when the blueprint starts to land in the state's general fund instead of being prepaid in an education trust fund. So once you have to pay cash for that endeavor, that makes everything harder because that's probably a couple billion in next year's budget. And then just the math is wrong on expenditures and revenues for the state generally. So I think you're right. Whether it's going to be in the BRFA, the one big bill, and it's just going to be 175 pages of hard decisions, or whether it ends up being here's the series of things that we have to do as part of a fiscal plan for the year. I don't know. I don't know which is better, to put it all in one bill or have it in a series of like connected bills. But either way, they got a lot of lifting to do next year. It's going to be no picnic.
Yep. So at this point for this year's, for the fiscal 27 budget, the House has the budget in the BRFA on the floor. Once they finish their floor work, everything will head to a conference committee. And, that's where they'll resolve the differences between the House and the Senate. And for counties, we talked about the AOT cost shift is the biggest item that is not consistent between the House and the Senate in terms of county governments and how we operate. And then again, of course, that partial pension shift, certainly we're going to have more to say about that, Michael. But beyond that, and in the conference committee, I don't think that it's going to be a terribly long conference committee. They don't have too many differences. There are some things, but again, for counties, it's really that assisted outpatient treatment is the big difference between the two, and we're going to fight to take the House version where you just cut that out of the BRFA.
I think the thing we've got going for us there is it's not like the budget was balanced on this. It's not like the plan gets $20 million out of whack if the House were to prevail and this big policy issue gets pulled out of the budget and reserved for its own bill someday. So that's helpful that it doesn't have a big firm, $37.1 million attached to that where suddenly your bottom line gets messed up. So that's helpful for us.
Right. So we will certainly stay engaged as the budget moves to the finish line. And obviously there are a lot of bills floating around still that counties and MACO are paying close attention to. A lot of bills are dead. A lot of bills did not make the crossover deadline. We have a lot of coverage on the Conduit Street blog, so check that out. We're updating constantly which bills are moving, which bills aren't, which bills are amended, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can also see all of the MACO testimony on our blog and on our website, so you can follow along. We're really transparent about what we're doing, the bills that are alive, the bills that are dead, and how they affect county government. So hopefully everyone listening here is also following along on the blog. We'll make sure to post all those links. But Michael, any final thoughts from you as we are getting near the end of March and heading into April and towards Sine Die?
I'll just say we've got a little more than 2 weeks left in the legislative session. There's still time for another issue or two to pop up out of nowhere and suddenly have everybody's hair on fire. So I'll set the over-under on like 1.5 big issues yet to emerge.
It seems like there's too much time. Most of the work seems wrapped up, but there's still multiple weeks remaining. There's a big energy bill being heard today in the Senate. So, I mean, I'm sure a lot to come with that too, but I'm with you. Like, there's still plenty of time for stuff to pop up. Opening day for the Orioles is tomorrow, so I assume most of these people will not be here. They'll be in Baltimore at the game and doing what they do. But beyond that, they still have weeks left in session to sort out whatever pops up.
Right. I remember in the old Batman TV show, Adam West would sometimes say, "It's quiet, perhaps a bit too quiet." And I kind of feel that way. So
it feels. I know it's an election year, and I know you typically don't want to do too much. You want to get home and talk about all the great things you did in campaign, but it seems even for an election year, very, very quiet, which makes us nervous. But we're going to continue to be down here and following along and keep our listeners engaged. But we'll leave it there for today. Make sure you are following along again on the blog, on our website. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. And again, you can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter. And then again, please keep track of the Conduit Street blog and our website. There's no better resource in town to keep track of what's going on. I'll hang my hat on that all day long. But for Michael Sanderson and for our esteemed producer, Chantal Malcolm Lynn, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.